Now here we're resuming our fairy doll story on chapter 2. Here we go. Do you remember what happened in chapter 1? Elizabeth got the good fairy from her great-grandmother. Well, here we go. Chapter 2. How can I take care of her? Asked Elizabeth. She is to take care of you, said Mother. But as you know, if you have read any fairy stories, fairies have a way of doing things the wrong way around. Pooh, she's only an ordinary doll dressed up in fairy clothes, said Josie, who was jealous. She's not ordinary, said Elizabeth, and as you will see, Elizabeth was right. What's her name? Asked Josie. She doesn't need a name. She's fairy doll, said Elizabeth. And how dare I take care of her? She asked. Fairy doll looked straight in front of her, but Elizabeth must have touched the wand. It stirred gently, very gently, in fairy doll's hand. Where will she live? Asked Josie. She can't live in the doll's house. Fairies don't live anywhere, said Josie scornfully. They must, said Elizabeth. Mother says some people think fairies were the first people, so they must have lived somewhere. And she went and asked Father, Father, where did the first people live? In caves, I expect, said Father. Elizabeth can't make a cave, said Josie. Elizabeth had just opened her mouth to say no when ting went a sound in her head. It was as clear and small as one of the glass Christmas bells. Ting! Bicycle basket, it said. Elizabeth knew what a cave was like. There had been caves at the seaside. There was one in the big wood across the field, and this very Christmas there was a clay model cave in the creche at school. If she had been a clever child, she would have argued, bicycle basket? Not a bicycle basket. But not being clever, she went to look. She unstrapped the basket from her bicycle and put it on its side. The ting had been right. The bicycle basket on its side was exactly the shape of a cave. The cave in the wood had grass on top, brambles and bracken and trees and grass. What's fairy grass? Asked Elizabeth. And ting, a word rang in her head. The word was moss. She knew where moss was. They had gathered some from the wood for the Christmas tree tub. A week ago, Elizabeth would not have gone to the wood alone, but now she had Fairy Doll, and she set out through the garden, across the road and fields. Soon she was back with her skirt held up full of moss. She covered the outside of the bicycle basket with the moss like a cozy green thatch. Then she stood the basket on a box, made a moss lawn around it. Later on I'll have beds of tiny real flowers, she said. It is odd how quickly you get used to things, Elizabeth asked, and the ting answered. It was a little like a slot machine. What shall I put on the floor? She asked. Ting, it's in the garage. A cleverer child would have said in the garage. Josie, for instance, would not have gone there at all, but Elizabeth went, and there in the garage, Father was sawing up logs. What did they put on the cave floors? Asked Elizabeth. Sand, I expect, said Father. Sand was far, far away at the seaside. Elizabeth was just going to say with a sigh that was no good when she looked at the pile of sawdust that had fallen from the logs. And sawdust? Fairy sand? Said the ting. What about a bed? Said Josie. A bed? Asked Elizabeth, and came back the ting. Try a shell. A coconut shell? Asked Elizabeth, watching the blue tits swinging on the bird table. But a coconut seemed coarse and rough for a little fairy doll. A shell? A shell? Why not a real shell? Elizabeth had brought one back from the seaside. She had not picked it up. The landlady had given it to her. It was big, deep pink inside, and if you held it to your ear, you heard far off the sound of the sea. It sounded like a lullaby. Fairy Doll could lie in the shell and listen. It made a little private radio. The shell needed a mattress. Flowers, said the ting. Josie would have answered that there were no flowers now, but is there a soft winter flower like feathers? Asked Elizabeth. Ting, came the answer, Old Man's beard. Do you know Old Man's beard that hangs on the trees and the hedges from autumn to winter? Its seeds hang in soft fluff. And Elizabeth picked a handful of it. Then she found a deep red leaf for a cover. It was from the Virginia creeper that grew up the front of the house. Soon the cave was finished, and with fairy things, said Elizabeth. She asked Father to cut her 2 bits from a round, smooth branch. They were 3 inches high and made a table and a writing desk. There were toadstools for stools stuck in the sawdust. They stood upright. On the table were acorn cups and bowls and small leaf plates. Over the writing desk was a piece of dried out honeycomb. It was exactly like the rack of pigeonholes over Father's desk. Fairy Doll could keep her letters there, and she could write letters. Elizabeth found a tiny feather and asked Godfrey to cut its point to make a quill pen like the one Mother had. And for writing paper there were petals of a Christmas rose. If you scratch a petal with a pen, better still, a pen, it makes fairy marks. Later on, there'll be all sorts of flower writing paper, said Elizabeth. There was a broom made of fir twig, a burr for a door scraper, a berry on a thread made a knocker. In summer, I'll get you a dandelion clock, she told Fairy Doll. You haven't got a bath, said Josie. Fairies don't need baths, said Elizabeth. They wash outside in the dew. Hold on a minute. Bless me, it's cold. I'm sneezing. Hang on a second. You're not going to catch my cold through the screen, are you? All right, where am I at? Sorry about that. We were talking about the bath, wasn't we? Okay. Fairies don't need baths, said Elizabeth. They wash outside in the dew. It was odd. It was odd. She was beginning to know about fairies. What does she eat? Asked Josie. Snow ice cream, said Elizabeth. It was snowing. Holly-baked apples and hips off the rose trees. Hips are too big for a little doll like that, said Josie. They are fairy pineapples, said Elizabeth with dignity. Look what Elizabeth has made, cried Christabel, and she said in surprise, It's pretty. Godfrey came to look. Gosh, said Godfrey. Josie put out her hand to touch a toadstool, and a funny feeling stirred inside Elizabeth, a feeling like a hard little wand. Don't touch, said Elizabeth to Josie. Spring came, and Fairy Doll had a hat made out of crocus and a pussy willow fuzz powder puff. She ate fairy bananas, which were bunches of cat skins rather than large bananas, and fairy lettuces, which were hawthorn buds, rather small. She ate French rolls, the gold-brown beech leaf buds, with primrose butter. The beds in the moss lawn were planted with violets out of the wood. One morning, as they were all starting off to school, Christabel said, as usual, Elizabeth, you haven't brushed your teeth. Elizabeth was going back when she stopped. But I have, she said. She had been in the bathroom, and ting, brush your teeth had come in her head. I brushed them, said Elizabeth. Amazed, Christabel was amazed as well. A few days afterwards, Mistress Thrum said in school, let's see what Elizabeth can do, which meant, let's see what Elizabeth can't do. Stand up, Elizabeth, and say the 7 times table. 7 times 1 or 7, said Elizabeth, and there was a long pause. 7 times 2, Mrs. Thorpe said encouragingly. Elizabeth stood dumb, and the class began to laugh. Hush, children, 7 times 2. Excuse me. I hate wintertime colds, but better than a summertime cold, I guess. 7 times 2, Mrs. Thrupp said encouragingly. Elizabeth stood dumb, and the class began to laugh. Hush, children, 7 times 2, ting, are 14. And Elizabeth went on, 7 3s are 21, 7 4s are 28, right up to 7 12s are 84. At the end, Mrs. Thrupp and the children were staring. Then they clapped. And reading, they had come to the story of Sleeping Beauty. Elizabeth looked hopelessly at the difficult words. Her eyes were just beginning to fill with tears when, ting! The words Lilac Fairy seemed to skip off the page into her head. It says Lilac Fairy, she said. Go on, said Mrs. Thrupp. Go on, Elizabeth. Elizabeth went on. Lilac Fairy, Spinning Wheel, Prince Charming. Ting, ting, ting went the bell. Good girl, those are difficult words, said Mrs. Thrupp. In sewing, they began tray cloths and embroidery stitches. Perhaps it was from making the small-sized fairy things that Elizabeth's fingers had learned to be neat. The needle went in and out, plock, 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 and there was no trace of blood. You're getting quite nimble, said Mrs. Thrupp, and she told the class, nimble means nimble, clever and quick. Does she mean I'm clever? Elizabeth asked the little boy next to her. She could not believe it. Soon it was summer. Fairy Doll had a Canterbury bell for a hat. Her bed had a peony petal cover now. She ate daisy poached eggs, rose petal ham, and lavender rissoles. Lady slippers and pimpernels were planted in the moss. What's the matter with Elizabeth? Asked Godfrey. She's not half such a little duffer as she was. That was true. She was allowed to take the Sunday newspapers in for Father, and Mother trusted her to wash up by herself. You can use my paint box if you like, said Christabel. You can take your own bus money, said Josie. Run to the shop, said Mother, and get me a mop and a pack of matches, a pot of strawberry jam, half a pound of butter, and a pound of ginger nuts. What have you brought? She asked when Elizabeth came back. A pound of ginger nuts, half a pound of butter, a pot of strawberry jam, a packet of matches, a mop, said Elizabeth, counting them out. But you still can't ride the bicycle, said Josie. It grew hot. Fairy Doll had a nasturtium leaf for a sunshade, and Elizabeth made her a poppy doll. To make a poppy doll, you turn the petals back and tie them down with a grass blade for a sash. The middle of the poppy makes the head, with the fuzz for hair, and for arms you take a bit of poppy stalk and thread it through under the petals. Then the poppy doll is complete, except that it only has one leg. Perhaps that was why Fairy Doll did not play with hers. Something was the matter with Fairy Doll. Her dress had become a little draggled and dirty after all these months. But it was more than that. Her wings looked limp. The wand in her hand was still. Something was the matter in Elizabeth, too. The bell did not say ting any more in her head. Dull, 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 it said. Dull, said Elizabeth. Does it mean Fairy Doll is dull with me? Asked Elizabeth. She felt sad. Then she felt ashamed. A fairy likes flying. Naturally, if you had wings, you would like flying too. Sometimes Elizabeth would hold Fairy Doll up in the air and run with her. Then the wings would lift, the wand would wave, the gauze dress fly back. But Elizabeth was too plump to run for long. I'll put her on my bicycle and fly her, Godfrey offered. You mustn't touch her, said Elizabeth. Well, fly her yourself, said Godfrey, offended, and he rode off. Fly her yourself. Ting went the bell, and it was a bell, not a drum. Ting, ting, fly, fly. So that was what Fairy Doll was wishing. Elizabeth went slowly into the garage and looked at the pale blue, still brand new bicycle. "It doesn't hurt so much to fall off in summer as in winter," said Elizabeth, but her voice trembled. Her fingers trembled too as she tied Fairy Doll onto the handlebars. Then Elizabeth put her foot on the pedal. "Push, pedal, pedal," she said, and shut her eyes. "But you cannot ride even the smallest bicycle with your eyes shut." She had to open them, but it was too late to stop. The drive from the garage led down a slope to the gate, and ting, away went the bicycle with Elizabeth on it. For a moment she wobbled. Then she saw the silver wings filling and thrilling as they rushed through the air, and the wand blew round and round. Pedal, pedal, pedal. It might have been Christabel talking, but it was not. Pedal. Elizabeth's hair was blown back. The wind rushed past her. She felt she was flying too. She came to the gate and fell off. "Ow!" groaned Elizabeth. But she had flown. She knew what Fairy Doll wanted. Her leg was bleeding, but she turned the bicycle around to start off down and drive again. Elizabeth was late for tea. "What have you been doing?" asked Christabel. "There's no jam left," but Elizabeth did not care. You've worn your frock, all the buns are gone," said Godfrey, but Elizabeth did not care. "You're all over scratches and dust," said Josie. "We've eaten the cake." But Elizabeth still did not care. "Well, where have you been?" asked Mother. Excuse me again. Elizabeth answered, "Riding my bicycle." Christabel was pleased. Godfrey was very pleased. But Josie said, "Pooh, it isn't Elizabeth who does things, it's Fairy Doll." Just a minute. Just a minute. Be some more water here. This has got to get better soon. If it wasn't at first it was my eye, now it's this cold and sore throat and a cough. I'm falling apart. All right. "Pooh, isn't Elizabeth who does things, it's Fairy Doll." "It is?" asked Elizabeth. "Try without her and you'll see," said Josie. Elizabeth looked at Fairy Doll, who was sitting by her on the table. "But I'm not without her," said Elizabeth. Autumn came and brought the fruit. Brownie berries were fairy plums and green gages. A single blackberry pip was a grape. A hazelnut was pork with crackling. In every garden people were making bonfires, and Elizabeth made one in the fairy garden. It was of pine needles and twigs, and she watched it carefully. Its smoke went up no bigger than a feather. It was altogether a fairy time. In the woods she found toadstools so close together that they looked like chairs, put ready for a concert. She gave a fairy concert, but it ought to be crickets and nightingales, said Elizabeth. There were silver trails over the leaves and grass, fairy paths, she said. Snails, snapped Josie. No doubt about it. Josie was jealous. School began and Elizabeth was moved up. She was learning the 12 times table, reading to herself, and knitting a scarf. She was allowed to ride her bicycle on the main road, to stay up till 7:30 every night. Then on a late October day, when the first frost was on the grass, Fairy Doll was lost. Oh, that's the end of chapter 2, and we'll have to go on to chapter 3. Oh, how much more? Oh, at least one more chapter in this story. We'll be back.